And if we're going to be honest, we have this enemy that whispers into our ear that says exactly that same thing. You're not good enough. And we look at the tasks in front of us and we're like, man, I just can't do it. I can't do what God has asked of me. And maybe for you, you're like, man, it's a new season of life. It's a new career opportunity that God has placed in front of you. It's a health struggle. It's a new responsibility. Maybe it's something God's calling you to. Maybe it's to serve in some capacity in ministry. Maybe it's to volunteer in the nursery. We all need that. Maybe it's to lead in a different way. Maybe it's a mission trips to go on. And you feel that calling from God, and you're just like, I'm not sure I have what it takes. I'm not sure I'm capable, let alone actually able to succeed. It's kind of like parenting, right? Nothing removes your confidence quicker than being a parent. You're like, I literally had plans and knew what I was going to do, but by the time the third kid comes in, it's like, hey, do it, embrace yourself, children, right? All of us at some point, we've dealt with this feeling of insecurity, of inadequacy. And living in a social media age just makes things worse. Because no matter what you and I do, there's always somebody online who does it better and faster and is better than us. If I'm going to just be honest with you, I feel this weight in my role as a pastor. See, there was a day and age when the role of pastor meant, hey, we get to teach the Bible to people, and we just get to love people well. But nowadays, the role of pastor includes being a strategic planner, being a social and digital marketing, and production and technology, and understanding culture and generations, and all these different things. And no matter how often I'm just like, man, I'm just trying to love people well, man, I feel the weight of people assuming my motives for me. People choosing not to give me a benefit of the doubt, let alone even ask me. And there's times in this role where I feel I'm not enough. I'm not capable. Yet God has put a calling on my life. And the question I want to wrestle with you this morning is this. What do you do when the calling that God has placed on your life outweighs what you think you are capable of? What do we do when God's placed this call, placed this thing in front of us and said, this is what I have for you, but we look and we think, I'm not capable, I'm not enough, I can't do that. We are starting a new series for the next 8 weeks, a series that we're going to call I Am. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 7 I am statements that Jesus makes in the Gospel of John. These statements that Jesus makes are directed to areas of humanity's greatest brokenness and need. And what these statements do, what Jesus is going to do by saying, I am whatever it happens to be, he's trying to help us to understand that the things that God has called us to do, we may feel like we're incapable, but he's not, right? That what God calls us to do, he calls us not because we're capable, not because we have the ability, but because he does. That he works in us and through us. Not because I am, but because he is. In fact, this may be one of the biggest things for us to learn as Christians if we're going to be faithful to God. If we're going to be faithful to what he's called us to, if we're going to be faithful to having an impact on our community and for the kingdom of God, it may be understanding this idea that I am not enough, but he is. This is a series I think we all need. This is a series that I need. This is a series that I pray that God is going to use for each of us. Today, the passage that Michelle read for us is the original I am statement from Exodus chapter 3. And what we're going to see is that for all that we feel like we lack, for all that we feel like we don't have the ability to do, Jesus is the great I am. That when we feel like we are not enough, the good news is he is. When we can't, he can. Context for Exodus chapter 3, it's all about Moses. Now, the story of Moses was born in a unique time in Israel. Israel had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They'd been slaves there. And Pharaoh became concerned because the Israelites were growing too numerous. There's too many of them. So Pharaoh issued a decree that all the baby boys would be killed. And that's where Moses is born. And if you know the story, his parents, they put Moses in a basket in the river, and they float him down the river. And just by chance, he was picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. And he is adopted into Pharaoh's family. He is raised in Pharaoh's household, a household full of privilege and opportunity and wealth. And Moses was destined for success until he grew up. And he felt that God was asking him to do more. He felt that God was calling him to deliver Israel, and it went bad. It went bad quickly. He saw some Egyptians that were abusing an Israelite man. And so he took matters into his own hands, and he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand. And the next day, some Israelites saw him, and rather than saying, "Hey, Moses, you're our deliverer," they say, "Who are you? Are you going to kill us as well?" And then, of course, Pharaoh heard what Moses did, and Pharaoh tried to kill Moses. And Moses was on the run. He fled to the wilderness in Midian, which is not a good place. This is like saying I fled to Wiley City, right? That's not the cream of the crop. He meets a girl, gets married, and the next 40 years, he tends his father-in-law's sheep. His life is turned upside down. A life of obscurity and nobody. And that's where Exodus 3 picks up. Now, Moses was keeping flock for his father-in-law, Jethro. And he was led into the wilderness. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame in the midst of a bush. And Moses looked, and behold, the bush was burning, but was not consumed. Verse 3, Moses said, "I will turn aside and see this great sight as to why this bush has not been burned." When the Lord saw that Moses had turned, God called him out of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." And Moses replied, "Here I am." And God said, "Do not come near, but take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground." Now, this could be a whole message in itself, but we don't have much time for it. So I just want to pause and just point out that this right here is the extraordinary breaking into the ordinary. And that is what happens so often in our lives, where we're just going through the mundane things of life. We're just going through the motions, doing the things that are in front of us. And all of a sudden, God breaks in with the extraordinary and transforms our ordinary and simple and comfortable into something holy. Listen, there are some of us in this room, you've got some circumstances going on in your life right now, some things that you don't understand. You're like, "Man, I've just been living life, and all of a sudden now there's something new, there's something different, there's something we don't understand, there's a challenge in front of us." This is when the extraordinary breaks into the ordinary, where God is preparing to do something miraculous in our lives. That is holy ground. Verse 6, God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." These are the forefathers of the Jewish nation. And it says Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Verse 7, the Lord said, "Surely I've seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them to the land flowing with milk and honey and ribeye steaks and milkshakes and pumpkin pies and Seahawks wins," like just contextualizing it, right? This is a land that we all want to go to. Verse 9, "Behold, the cry of the people has come to me. I've seen the oppression which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you might bring my people out." Here's what we've got. At this point, God is telling Moses, this is what I'm going to do. I've heard the cry of the people. I've seen their affliction. I've seen them being oppressed. And I have come, and I'm going to lead them out of Egypt to this land of Seahawks winds and flowing milk and honey in this wonderful place. This is what God's going to do. Oh, and by the way, Moses, I'd like you to help me. I'd like you to be a part of it. Moses, I'm the main character, but Moses, you're the tool. Verse 11. But Moses said, God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Again, this is where I want to pause and say, how many of us know what Moses feels like? Where the task is given to us and we're like, who am I? Who am I to go and do, God, what you've called me to do? God, why would you ask this of me? And in fact, when Moses says, who am I? This is the same statement that the Israelites made in chapter 2 after he killed the Egyptian. Who are you? Why should we listen to you? Why should we follow you? Man, there are some of us that have been criticized for such a long time. Criticized by a parent, a boss, a spouse. And if we're going to be honest, we hear that nagging voice and we began to believe what they said about us. And we look at the things that God is asking of us and we're like, who am I? Who am I to do this, God? I'm not capable. Verse 12, God says, I will be with you. And I want you to notice something here, because this is just mind-blowing to me. This is where I'm trying to get my head and my heart to connect here. Because God calls Moses to do something that was too big for Moses. God calls Moses to do this big thing, and Moses is insecure. He's afraid. He's hesitant. God, I'm not capable. And notice how God deals with him. How does God deal with Moses' insecurity? Not by saying, Moses, you just need to have some positive thinking. Not by telling Moses, look, you're great. You're wonderful. I have wonderful plans for you. God doesn't tell him to believe in himself. What does God do? God, Moses, I've got this task for you. Moses, it's too big for me. I'm capable. And God says, don't worry, because I will be with you. You see, this is one of those things that I feel like we have to grasp, is our confidence doesn't come from our potential or from believing in ourselves. Our confidence comes by us having a clearer view of God and who he is. That when we look at the things that God has placed in front of us, the task that he has given us, we accomplish those things and we have confidence in them, not because we're smart and funny and charming and capable and powerful and all those things. No, our confidence comes from having a big enough view of who God is, knowing that he is with us. In fact, I want you to keep that thought, because that's going to be where we're going to hit in a minute. Now, Moses, God says, hey, I'm with you. And Moses doesn't get it. Kind of like some of us. We're a little stubborn, right? And he keeps asking, well, God, what about all my deficiencies? I can't go and talk to Pharaoh. I don't speak well. I stutter for a living. That's weird. I stutter. I can't go and speak. What if the people don't listen to me? I mean, he's all these insecurities and excuses. We all have insecurities and excuses, right? Well, I can't be this because of this. But Moses, he's got these excuses. But I want you to notice God doesn't answer those excuses. He ignores those questions. He comes back and God focuses on this. He focuses on what God has done, what God is doing, and what God will do. He's telling Moses, this whole idea of me calling you is not about you having what it takes. It's about me accomplishing my purposes. Moses, you've got a role in it. Absolutely, you've got a role in it. But the success, the power, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. In fact, this is what happened. Verse 13. Moses said, well, if I come to the people of Israel and I say to them, God, your father has sent me, and they ask, what's his name? What do I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, has sent me to you. And this is his name forever. And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. The I am, the great I am. In fact, when you look at this word is often we see it as Yahweh. And it simply means I am. In fact, you'll see this in your Bible. It is typically spelt L-O-R-D in all capitalized letters. You'll find that thousands of times in the Old Testament. Built on the Hebrew word for I am. And what God is trying to say to Moses, what God is trying to say to us, I am. He is. He's not like anything we've ever experienced. He doesn't have needs. He doesn't require help. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't have limits. He doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have an end. Simply, he was, he is, and he always will be. By saying, I am, he's saying, Moses, you don't define me by your reality, but rather I define your reality because I am. In fact, the burning bush is simply a glimpse of the great I am. Now, we would understand that fire needs fuel to keep burning, right? You're going to put something in the fire pit. You got to keep putting wood in there for that fire to keep burning. But Moses comes to this bush, and it continually burned without ever burning the bush because it was self-sustaining. It didn't require anything. And that's what God is saying. I am the great I am. I don't need anything. I'm self-sustaining. In fact, this name I am is repeated constantly throughout the scriptures, constantly throughout the Old Testament. Every time the people of God had this great need, God would reveal himself in a different way. When they were sick, God said, I am the Jehovah Rapha. I am your healer. When they were lost and afraid and alone, God said, I am Jehovah Ra. I'm your shepherd. When the people of God face impossible circumstances, God said, I am Jehovah Jireh. I am your provider. Again and again and again. Our needs are met by the great I am. And here's like to simplify this, like here's what's happening, right? God breaks into Moses' ordinary and brings the extraordinary. Calls him to something that Moses feels completely incapable of. Those insecurities run deep. And God doesn't tell him, oh, just believe in yourself, right? Just trust your experience and your knowledge and your potential. No, God says, you know how you do this? It's because I am. The eternal I am is on your side. And guess what? You don't need anything else. You don't need anything else. You simply need the I am. Moses, it's not about who you are and what you're capable of. It's about who he is. Moses says, well, God, I'm not enough. God says, I am. Well, I'm not skilled enough. And God says, I am. Well, I'm not experienced enough. And God says, I am. Well, I'm not confident enough. And God says, I am. What is it that God has called you to that you feel incapable of, that overwhelms you, that you would say, God, I'm not enough. God, that's too much. If we would be honest with some of us in this room, some of us have missed out on what God has called us to because we felt like we were not capable. And we said no. And God said, I have something special for you. See, the truth is, we're not enough. None of us are. And you're like, really? I came to church to have a pastor tell me I am not enough? Hey, amen. Amen. Thanks, Pastor Kevin. But you see, here's Here's a summary for this whole idea of I am. Here's a summary for this passage. It's the things that God calls us to are not based on our abilities. They're based on who God is and his abilities. For everything we lack, for everything that we don't have, for everything that we need, for everything that we don't think we can do, God says, I am. And this is profound. This is huge for us to grasp. That whatever it is in front of us that we're like, man, I just don't know if I can do this, God. He says, listen, if I've called you to it, I'm not going to tell you just to believe in yourself. I'm going to tell you, I am. I am. You know, we have this idea that God needs victors. God doesn't need victors. God simply needs vessels. A vessel is something that is used by God. A vessel has to be emptied first and foremost. Has to empty of their strength, of their wisdom, of their knowledge, of their abilities. They empty themselves of that, and then they get filled with something different. And this is what we are. We empty ourselves, and we are filled with God. We are filled with God, and then he works in us and through us, which means that really the key to us being used by God and doing what God calls us to is all about surrender. And the hardest thing about surrender, we don't like to give up control. No, I want to be in control. I want to have control. I want to guarantee where we're... You can drive, but I'm going to be in the passenger seat telling you how to drive, right? Because it's control. And God is simply calling us to trust him, to submit to him. Again, this is why some of us don't experience the power of God in our lives. Because we've never surrendered. We've never acknowledged, I'm not capable. It's our pride and arrogance that keeps us from the things of God. You know, ultimately, this is what Christianity is all about. This is what the gospel says. The gospel doesn't say that we'd become righteous and we'd be good enough for God. It's not that we have enough potential that God looks at us and says, I love your potential, you could be a part of my group. That's not the way it works. The gospel says we are not enough, but Jesus is. The gospel says we are not enough, but Jesus was righteous for us, died the death that we deserve so he would give us his righteousness. It's all about surrender and trust. And if we would humble ourselves and say, God, I'm not, if we would trust in him, that we'd say, God, I'm not righteous, and Jesus would say, yes, but I am. God, I'm powerless, and Jesus would say, but I am your power. God, I'm empty, and Jesus would say, I'm your fullness. I'm your life. God, I'm dead, and Jesus says, I'm your resurrection. God, I'm defeated, and Jesus says, I am your hope. This is the gospel, folks. Us surrendering and submitting God in us and through us, that as we surrender our hearts and lives to God, that he fills us and lives in us. We can do all things through him who strengthens us. And this series, the next 7 weeks, we're going to look at these 7 statements that Jesus made in the Gospel of John. That he identifies himself as the I am, and then applies that to some of our greatest areas of need. To those who hunger, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. To those of us feeling like we're living in darkness, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. To those of us that need a fresh start, God says, I am the door. To those of us that feel alone and abandoned and lost, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Those of us afraid of death, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those of us that are alone and confused, Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Those of us feel like we're incapable of doing good. Jesus says, I am the true vine that produces good fruit. Yeah, the goal for this series, the next couple of weeks, is not we to have better views of ourselves. It's not that we would build our self-esteem and make us think we're capable of more. Heads up, that's not where we're going the next couple of weeks. My goal is that we would have a bigger view of God, of who He is and what He could do in us and through us. That we would see that all the things that God calls us to do that can be hard and challenging. And let's be honest, there's a lot of things that can be hard and challenging. Maybe it's not going to be delivering Israel out of Egypt. Sometimes parenting can be hard and challenging. And marriage and work and dealing with addiction and overcoming sin and trying to live the Christian life and live the fruit of the Spirit and trying to make a difference in our community. Yeah. We're going to look and see this has less to do with our ability and more to do with our trusting and our depending on Him. In fact, I had a conversation with a gal this week, a gal who's lived a life with a lot of struggles, a lot of brokenness in relationships and her work, dealing with addiction. My heart breaks for this. Some real difficult things she's had to go through. I've got hope for her. But one of the things from this conversation that I hear from her again and again, she's still striving to be enough. Still striving to say, listen, I'm smart enough to figure it out. I have all the potential. Things are hard, and she's despondent because she feels like she's losing control. It's everybody else's fault. She's a victim. She's never come to the point when she's realized, God, I just need to surrender. God, I'm not enough. But God, you are. And God, these hard things you put in front of me, if I would just come to the point of getting on my knees and surrendering and being a vessel, that you would work in me and through me to accomplish more than I could ever imagine. And I sat and thought about my own life. I thought about the greatest victories that I've seen, greatest leadership moments. Never once have they been the result of my plans and my wisdom and my strength. Because I'll be honest, typically when I make those plans, I screw things up. Like Moses, and they just blow up. But when I surrender and set my plans aside, that's when God does the remarkable. In fact, the best moments of my marriage has not been because I have it all figured out. Because I surrendered, asked God to work through me. The best moments of my parenting is not because I had a plan on how to raise all these kids and I read a book that told me how to do it. No, the best plans, the best successes of my parenting has been, I'm at the end of my rope and I have no one else to trust but God. And I'm like, God, would you work in me? When I've dealt with sin and brokenness and things in my own life, I haven't overcome those things because I was strong and I had such strong willpower and because I was so smart. It's because I dropped on my knees and said, God, I need you. In the last 11 years of pastoring this church, the sweetest moments in this time have literally been the times when I'm at the end of my rope. I'm like, God, I don't know what to do. God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know why I'm here. God, I simply look to you. It's kind of like that's when God gives us these sweetest moments. Where it's not because I'm going to get the glory, because I've got plans. It's simply because, God, I'm depending on you. And guess who gets the glory then? Listen, the things that God calls us to do, it's not because It's not based on our abilities. It's based on God's abilities. For everything we lack, for everything we need, for everything that we cannot do. Jesus is the great I am. And just a simple way of application this morning. What I want to ask you to do is name your insecurity. Whatever task God has placed in front of you, you feel God's calling you to be a good spouse, to work, to serve, whatever it happens to be, what is your insecurity? What is the excuse you say to God, I can't do that? I'm going to ask you to write it down. I am not blank enough. What is that for you? Write it out. Literally write it out. I'm not strong enough. I'm not wise enough. I'm not spiritual enough. I'm not capable. I'm too broken. I'm too overwhelmed. I'm afraid. Listen, can we acknowledge that before God? Can we bring that insecurity and say, God, I don't feel like I can do it because I'm holding on to this? Because guess what? If we can acknowledge that before God, God, I am not this enough. Right next to that, right underneath that, I want you to write, I am not this enough, but Jesus is blank enough for me. I'm not strong enough, but Jesus is strong enough for me. I'm not wise enough, but Jesus is wise enough for me. I'm not sufficient enough, but Jesus is sufficient enough for me. I'm not righteous enough, but Jesus is righteous enough. Words are hard. Jesus is righteous enough for me. See, we are more than conquerors. Not because we're the conquerors, but simply because Jesus works in us and through us. We are fully equipped for every good work simply by trusting in Him and not in ourselves. The things that God calls us to. We have to figure out how to get this from our head to our heart. We may know this. Hearts sometimes have a hard time receiving it. The things that we are called to do are not based on our abilities, they're based on God's. He is enough. Let's pray.